Okay, let's see what's happening. Okay. Oh, it's saying something about Trevor. Okay. I don't want to go on Twitter anyway. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. I think we're okay.
Looks good.
There we go. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Perception Action Journal Club. This is actually a real journal club because we're actually talking about some writing when it's not like a kind of a general thing. So I'm happy to be joined by, enough time guest. He probably deserves a jacket or something. Andrew, been on the podcast. Thanks for joining me. Andrew, I always bring on when I have to talk about hard stuff. So this fits the bill for sure. But thanks for joining me, Andrew.
Oh, always a pleasure, always fun. And yeah, as soon as I heard you were planning on doing this, I felt morally obliged to offer my services.
So we're going to talk about this book, book Lectures on Perception, an Ecological Perspective by Michael Turvey. This was, I think you know a bit more about the actual where this was based on Michael Turvey's actual class lectures, right?
Yeah,
very much. It's kind of in the spirit of Gibson's Purple Perils, right?
Yeah,
it was him thinking aloud. Yeah,
I never had to. I never sat Turvey's course or any versions of it, but so I got it filtered through Jeff Bingham, who tried to get to the core of some of these things. But yeah, very famously, Turvey ran this class on perception and action at UConn, this graduate level seminar, and he made students read 30 or 40 things a week, and they would talk about it. And so he would start out with kind of a lecture where he would sort of present the context and things, and then they would just get into it. And then if I remember right, the assessment was basically you and Turvey locked in a room arguing until Turvey decided how well you'd paid attention to the class.
That's my experience with him.
So Turvey had been running and developing this for a million years at UConn, and then some of his students implemented versions of it in Cincinnati and a couple of other places as well. So some of those students went off and did a version of this. And then, so one of the things that Turvey was doing towards the end of his life was that he wanted to write all this down and turn it into a package. This is what you would have done in a semester or two at UConn if you were there.
Yeah, we were just saying, I believe they're working on perception lectures on action.
Yes,
based on his notes, and Claudia is working on that. So that'll be exciting to see. So so we're going to talk about this. So I thought I'd just give a few notes about where we're headed and kind of. So this is so the people that are used to talking about coming here for applications of sports and things. We'll try to get into that when we can, but this is as far from this is hardcore theory, right? The ecological psychology. I was saying to Andrew before. When I first got into this, I was used to reading people like Bill Warren and Reinhard Bootsma. Kind of made an effort to make it more understandable and bring it down and simplify it. Michael Turvey, I was always frustrated a bit by it because he doesn't do that at all, right? He keeps it at a high level. But I get over the years, I've begun to appreciate why and what he was trying to achieve. And man, he was a smart guy. But so I've come to appreciate what he was trying to do more and more as I've got along.
Yeah, me too. I think, he is a frustrating writer in a lot of ways, but he does bring you along for the ride. He just expects you to do quite a bit of work to keep pace. But he does throw you in the deep end to a certain extent, but he is trying to bring you along. So, one of the things I do when I've been reading these and taking notes and things like that is trying to figure out what each chapter is about, because there's a lot of information in each chapter. And so the thing I was always trying to get was, what's he trying to achieve at this point? And therefore, why is he telling me about these various things? And the thing I find about Turvey is that if you do read him and you do spend some time with him, even if you don't agree with him, you come away smarter. And at the very least, you know what it is. Like, you know what you're up against if you want to argue with it, right? That's one of his big contributions. And I think we should take that really seriously, is he's just trying to put ecological psychology on the firmest, clearest, most rigorous footing he can. And even if even if he's wrong, at least we know where we're starting, and we know what we can try and do to poke at it. And that kind of solid foundation is A, very rare in psychology, but B, it's quite a gift as well to the field. And so, it is, but it is tough reading. It is, you really have to be prepared to get into it, spend some time in it, and also go back to it.
Yeah, I think he has real strength. I find a lot of really good scientists have this. He never takes anything for granted.
Yes.
Like when you use the word complexity, he doesn't go, "Oh, I know what you mean." No. What do you mean? Like he's gonna drill down and make sure every term, what do we actually mean by that? Instead of just what do we mean by a system? That's what the first chapter we're gonna talk about. You're not just gonna throw words around. He's really gonna drill down. So I appreciate it. I think that's really good scientists I know I call them sometimes they're deliberately dumb. They're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a very Turvey move, I think, is just to kind of keep asking the slightly annoying question and burrowing down. That was very typical of the way he would kind of interact as well.
So I hope you enjoy this. We'll go along. We're gonna talk about the first 2 chapters today, and then kind of work through the book as we go along. Like I said, I think it's really worth it. I think Turvey's gonna really build ecological psychology from the core principles.
Yeah.
And I think understanding these core principles is really important. So like I was saying, sometimes you see people use affordance in kind of a incorrect way, where if they understood where it comes from and the core principle, is I think it would help you a little bit. So
yeah, absolutely.
But in this one, so let's dive. So the first chapter we want to talk about is what kind of systems do we study? So this is I remember one of the first presentations I gave to coaches. I remember I called it "Why Coaches Need to Be System Thinkers," right? Something like that. So I think that I think everyone on the surface gets the idea that's a core principle of the ecological approach. We want to look at things as a system, and the fundamental system is the performer and their environment. We never want to break that apart. Turvey obviously takes that a bit further, and I should say, before we get too far along, Andrew has on your blog notes from 2 scientific psychologists. You have you went through these chapters previously, and you have some really good notes.
Yeah,
so I'll link to those.
Yeah, cool. And like this will be inspiration for me to crack on with that, because I'm a bit ahead, but I'll have to.
You ran out of speed. Yeah, I don't like. Yeah. So I guess so the first chapter. So as I said, so we want to talk about kind of what we're studying, right? Obviously, we're heading towards studying perception action. That's where we're going. But what I don't know what the best way. What kind of core message you take out of the first chapter? There's lots of little tidbits. I don't know if there's one overall.
Well, so having read ahead a little bit and read some and engaged with some of the later chapters, so there's some basically Turvey's laying groundwork at this point, and he's setting things up so that he can start ruling stuff out later on. So So one of the first things to note about this book is that it's lectures on perception, not how to do ecological psychology.
Yes.
Ecopsych's going to show up later.
He's kind of building it.
We're going to have to spend a lot of time engaging with the basic question of what does it mean for something to be able to perceive its environment? And so this first chapter for me is just kind of setting the scene that, look, at a basic level, the kind of thing that's we're talking about a physical system that can perceive and act in its environment. So what does each of those words mean? What kind of physical system could possibly engage with its environment through perception and action? And so he emphasizes, first of all, so there's 3 key words in this chapter. There's system, and then there's intentional and epistemic, which we can get into as well. And basically those 3 words are going to be like, he's setting the scene where he's like, look, if you're going to study perception, and if you're going to have a theory of perception, this is the ground. This is the basics that you have to front up to. And whatever your theory is, has to be able to engage with these things. So it's basically just setting the scene. And then he's going to be able to say, well, okay, so this theory that someone came up with, falls down because it completely fails to cope with this really important thing.
Yeah,
this,
it's going to point out some key.
Yeah,
topics
absolutely.
here,
But
which
it's
I
going to
really
give us
like.
a vocabulary for ruling stuff out and for identifying problems. Yeah.
Yeah. So the system. So a system. Sorry to interrupt. It's
Yeah.
like it's a interacting set of elements
Yep.
that produces some properties that you can't explain from any. If you take an individual element out of the system, its properties are not going to be the same as when it was in the system.
Yeah.
I guess a great example. I've never heard like a pile of rocks is
Yeah.
not a system, even though it's a bunch of elements, and you can describe their relationship, how far away each rock
Yeah.
stays the same if you pull it out of the pile. And
Yeah.
so I thought that was I really like that analogy.
Yeah. So, I mean, Turvey fronts up to the fact that, yeah, it's difficult to describe a system. Can we
so he does
describe
what's
what
not a
isn't
system.
Yeah. And that turns out to be difficult too. But yeah, exactly. Right. So the whole point of something being a system is that you've got a bunch of parts, and they're related to one another, but they depend on one another and they affect one another. Because if they don't, then they're not part of the, and then, things that are just next to one another but not relating or affecting each other aren't part of a system. And I think that kind of, Turvey spends time trying to be a little formal about this, which is good, but also I think the intuition seems fairly straightforward, right? Like it's a system because it's a bunch of parts that are all doing something to make the overall collection of bits be able to achieve something. And that's going to be the other thing is that, cognition and perception and action, none of those are achievements of any of the individual bits. All the individual bits are important and how they connect to one another is important. But we're going to want to talk about how behavior is the behavior of the system. That's going to be our unit of analysis. That's the other thing he's getting towards here.
Yeah. No, I think he talks, for me, we'll talk about kind of the properties, key properties, but there's a couple of really interesting points he brings, like, that he problems that we in science we get to not looking at the whole system. He gives a really interesting example with two people, one looking at the whole system, one only looking at part of it. And it kind of shows when you only look at part of it, that's when you need to bring in things like memory. You need boron intelligence to explain how that system can have this state. Because you're not seeing the whole system, which I think obviously that's what ecological psychologists want to dismiss. But so I thought that was an interesting example.
Well, yeah, because it's another notion, and it's connected up again to the why is it important to talk about systems? If you look at the behavior of something, this is right. So the other thing Turvey wants to set up is not only what is a system, but how could you possibly investigate one, and how do you know you're investigating it properly, right? And so he's just flagging up the problem at this point is that if you look at the behavior of a system and you can only see some of it, and it looks like whatever the system is doing is a bit magical because it's missing something, then there's two ways to respond. One is you whack in the additional feature like memory and you say that the system has memory or whatever, or you go, oh, maybe I'm missing something. I'm not characterizing the system correctly. And that's going to be a big push is if the behavior of your system seems like a bit of a miracle, you might be missing something. And that seems really obvious, except for the fact that, as we will discover across the book, the history of psychology and trying to study perception is getting to a certain point, reaching a point where you need a miracle, and sometimes literally just inserting God in there because that's the right idea, and potentially inserting representations might be the same kind of thing, for example, and so on. So it seems like a pretty obvious methodological point about being careful, but it turns out to be really important. That
for sure.
Yeah,
I think that's really fundamental. That's like Claire, lots of people's main point. Like in ecological psychology, when we get stuck, we turn back to the environment, or we try to find, or we got the wrong information. Then we don't appeal to something we can't observe. Representation
absolutely.
or something, right? That's the fundamental idea, right? You gotta, don't have the system correct if you get something. But
and the systems that we're talking about are complex and they're intentional, epistemic, and all these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, they're still physical systems. And in chapter 2, he talks a little bit about dualisms and how you have to be careful about those kinds of things. And so he is trying to just say that at the end of the day, we want to be able to build our explanations out of all the same sort of stuff and the same kinds of properties. And we don't want to if you introduce these two different kinds of things, you've got physical stuff and mental stuff. Right? As soon as you do that, you're in trouble, and you should take the hint that you've made a mistake, as opposed to thinking you've done something clever, right? And that's going to be quite a big move as well.
Yeah. I should, before I go to, I should also mention, anyone listening along, if you have any comments, questions, fire them at us. We'll try to. The other thing I really thought was, so it gets a little bit into trying to relate this to maybe concepts people know, the kind of decomposition task. It talks about two fundamental errors people make in breaking apart a system. One is this one drives me so. Assigning a part of a system a property that's a property of the whole system,
yes.
which is basically the cognitive neuroscience fMRI error, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the reason that behavior looks the way it is because the brain is the way that it is.
Yeah. This is one of my pet peeves. Whenever I read an article that starts, our brain does something, I stop reading. Your brain doesn't do things. You do things, right? So that's the whole system, right?
I literally just saw someone on Blue Sky today saying, talking about, there's a paper about oscillations in crowd behavior, and saying, well, look, all these interesting oscillations in crowd behavior. That's because your brain does oscillations. And it's like, yeah, brains oscillate, but that's not why the behavior is oscillating, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly. It's like the oscillation in the brain might be part of your story, but it's not the whole thing. And that's really, it's a really radical point. It's going to become a really radical point to say that actually behavior doesn't just come from brains. Like that's the radical element of the ecological approach, right?
Yeah.
Is being weirder about causation.
Yeah. It's one of those things that you hear, oh, okay, that makes sense, but you don't realize very profound kind of so that was a big, I think Turvey gives the example of a clock.
Yes.
What part of a clock does timing of the hour?
Yeah.
You can't just pull you can't just pull parts and that's really what, cognitive neuroscience tries to do. The hippocampus does memory, this part does decision making, when it's an overall property of the system that makes decisions and problem solve. So I thought that was good. And then the second fallacy, I love this analogy of, are we cutting up the system correctly? Like, so if you have a bike and you take it apart with a wrench, the parts you're left with sitting in front of you will probably make sense. You have a seat, pedals, right? Functionally, if you take it apart with a cutting torch, right, the pieces you have might not make a lot of sense. So,
and it's funny this. So this connects up. So Turvey's going to be mad about mechanism and sort of mechanism kind of theories, but there is a whole kind of field in sort of modern philosophy of science about mechanistic explanations. And I think there's a little bit of tension in some of the language there. So, because in the mechanistic sort of explanation theory, there is this notion that you have to be really careful about how you break your systems down in order to identify the parts. And you have to be really careful about doing it, and you have to pay attention to what the data are telling you. And so some of Turvey's objections about mechanism are going to actually just be about the kind of mechanical theories of Descartes and things like that. And then there are arguments about exactly how you break these things down and whether or not you can. And so, I think you might ecologically be able to break things down analytically in your science and study individual bits. Tony Chimera is a bit nervous about this for various reasons, and that connects to it. So there's lots of arguments here. And I'm on board with Turvey's caution, right? Like, if I want to study locomotion, I can't just study the legs, or I can't just study the affordances. The affordances are part of it, and the legs are part of it, and I might want to spend some time investigating those bits. But then I have to pay attention as are those sensible bits? Are in fact legs relevant parts, or maybe they're not? Or maybe pairs of legs are. Maybe legs with bodies are, etc. Right?
Yeah. Got a question here, Andrew. To put up here, the CES model.
All right.
Okay. Can we go? So, picture. That's the kind of, it looks like an amoeba in the book. I always say. What? So, what is what are the parts?
So the CES. So Turvey's trying to come up with just a minimal description of what a system is.
Mm-hmm.
And he proposes this minimal starting point, the CES model. And so it's composition, environment, and structure. And by composition, that means that there are parts that make up a given system. The things that make up a given system define and imply an environment, right? And yeah, then there are these structural relations. The different elements connect to one another, and that's what makes it a system. So I can show you the picture.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
So basically, the blob in the middle is a system, and the bit around it is it's the environment that it implies. And there are bits inside the system, and some of those bits are connected and relate to one another and influence each other. And that's the internal sort of structure of the system. And then some of those bits relate to bits in the environment, and those are how that's how the system is nested in its environment. And so a minimal kind of system has to have some bits. Those bits have to interact and relate to one another and have consequences for each other. And then also they have to be able to relate to and interact with parts of the environment. And so this is just kind of a pitch of if you're going to have a system, you need this. Yeah. And now, if you're going to have this particular kind of system, then we're going to have some rules about what counts as legitimate parts, what counts as how those things can be connected, etc.
Yeah. So is it fair to say, so the traditional system we talk about is the actor environment system. Here we're talking about, we're breaking the actor into kind of two pieces.
Yeah.
Right. The composition and structure. It was still the environment. Yeah.
And also, I have internal structure. I've got a nervous system. I've got a skeletal system. I've got a lymph system. I've got a muscular system, et cetera, et cetera. So I have a lot of bits that you can look at and talk about how they relate, but then they form me, and I imply an environment that I relate to. Yeah, exactly. Right.
And the key kind of thing, I guess we'll get to more in next chat, is we want to treat all these parts, talk about them in the same language, not one's a physical system, one's a mental system, that's the key one of the key parts of ecological psychology, right?
Absolutely. Trying to get it all into the same kind of thing.
It's the same type of material. I don't know if that's the best word, but and then so I think that's, so he's defining, we have to consider the whole system. We don't want to make these kind of errors. We're trying to, we don't want to, these fundamental errors about breaking apart, decomposing a system, and consider all there's two words, intentional, right? The system is intentional. It's a little bit different than the typical way we use intentional.
Yes.
It means that the system pertains to something, right? We perceive
about something. Yeah, it has aboutness.
Yeah, aboutness. That's where it uses.
So it comes from Brentano. He talks about that, and Brentano was big into this sort of intentionality kind of idea. But like my actions are about things. When I reach for my glass, my reaching is about, in quite an important way, it's about the glass, right? About the size and the shape and the location, where it is and how it's built and what I can do with it, etc. And and so again, right, so Turvey's going, what kind of system are we talking about? And so it's a system, so it has to have this composition and environment and structure and all these relationships. But it's not just any old system, because climate's a system.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the kind of system that can reach out and pick up a glass, for example, or play football or whatever. And so one of the other constraints now is the particular kind of system that we're talking about has this intentionality, this aboutness. And and so the question, how do you get that, is going to be one of the questions you have to, you owe the universe an answer if you want a theory about perception.
Yeah, so that's intentional. The other one, what's the other key? Epistemology. That's the other word, epistemic. So a system. Now we're getting into knowledge, right?
Yeah. So the system does know about some things, but then the question, No, so right, knowing about sounds like a mental representation, sounds like those, but that's the point is that mental representations and all those things are going to be one proposed way to get epistemic capabilities into a system. And so that it's not that those two things exactly mean the same. It's that one of them's a good faith effort to try and get epistemic capabilities into a system, and then the question is whether or not it works. But it's one of the things it's one of the things you're on the hook for if you want a theory of perception.
Yeah, it's like some again. This is something I've appreciated more. Is like well, when we talk about perception, you can't avoid getting into philosophy of
Absolutely
what it means. Do you know things? Is the world of you constructing a fake reality? Yeah. So he's going to definitely get into that. Question about distinction between composition and structure. So did I get this right? So composition is we have bones, blood, it's the material, and it could be combined in a different, is that too simple, into a different structure? You could make a human being, you could make a horse, you could make with the same structure, same composition can produce different structures.
I think so.
Yeah.
So I think the structure is kind of, I think the distinction, the way I would normally think of it, is the composition and the organization. So I think you're right. I think the composition are the bits you have to work with. Yeah. And then the structure is the way in which you have hooked those parts together. And you're right. If you take some parts and hook them together in one way, you get a person. And if you take similar parts and hook them together in a different way, you get a horse, right?
Yes.
Crudely, right?
And they both have that they're within their environment.
That's and in dynamical systems, there's always a distinction between the composition and the organization of a system. So the composition is what variables have you included in your equation, and then the structure is how have you arranged them? Are they multiplying with each other? Are they adding? Which ones multiply with which ones add and subtract with which other one, and so on and so forth. So there's a distinction. This is why dynamical systems is going to start coming in handy, because there's a nice overlap, very, very non-accidental overlap in the way these things, dynamical systems is a way of talking about dynamical systems, right? And we're trying to talk about particular kinds of systems. So I think that's the distinction that's going on there, is that you've got some bits and you can hook them together in a bunch of ways. And that's going to be quite important, because I've got a bunch of bits and they're hooked together in a particular way, and that makes my hand, but I can take those bits and arrange them into a fist, for example. Yes. And I can take those bits and arrange them into something that'll catch something or do a high five or scratch me, whatever. And so same composition, different organization.
Yeah, we're foreshadowing a long way down the road. We're getting into concepts of degrees of freedom and motor redundancy, right? It depend on your composition, and composition have difference. So in Turvey talks about knowledge about your life. Is he using it in the same way as Gibson? The knowledge of and about? I think so, right? When he talks about
right.
Knowing about is a discrete symbol strings that are presumed to stand for and represent the knowledge of a It sounds a little bit like what Gibson meant by knowledge about something.
Right.
It's an abstract understanding, symbolic. I don't know if he would want to draw. I don't think he would want to draw.
I think at this point he's suggesting that knowledge about is something you're going to have to be able to implement. And we're currently at a point in history where that's been implemented in a couple of different ways, computationally or through neural networks or what have you. And then the question is whether or not that's done the trick. Right. So on the bottom of page 10, he's sort of introducing the fact that we've tried to engage with this. And then the top of page 11, he says, as the lectures unfold, we address a very different possibility, namely that understanding epistemic intentional systems will actually require a real overhaul of the kinds of things that we think we know. So, all the traditional cognitive psychology has gone about answering those questions and it's equated knowing about with things like memory and language and perception, etc., and putting them into this computational theory. He's foreshadowing that in order to get that kind of behavior, you're going to be able to get epistemicness out of a system, but you're going to have to build it out of very different kinds of parts. And so to flag up, we're really going to have to get into some more complicated physics. And he's going to spend a lot of time pointing out that most of what we do right now is based in 17th century physics.
Yeah.
And the 20th and 21st centuries all have been about throwing basically all of that out and replacing it with an entirely different way of understanding physical systems. And that we're going to be able to avail ourselves of that.
Yeah. So you're getting a little flavor of this, right? So this chapter is only 10 pages long. It's very short, but it's got a lot in it. Yeah. But yeah, but I think you're right. He's kind of, I think the best way, I think it's good to think of this as kind of as lectures, right? They're building.
Yes.
He's building in pieces. And they're not meant to be a comprehensive whole. They are in a sense, but it's building. He's going somewhere with this.
Yeah. So think about each chapter he's building a system. Think about it that way. And this first chapter is giving us some of the composition, and it's giving us a few hints about some of the structure. But some of that structure won't become apparent until later chapters, for example, until we get some other pieces and can start connecting these things up. So I guess that's why I'm flagging up that these things are going to. The reason why he's talking about these things is because he's trying to set up all the stuff that you have to explain, and then he's going to start working on all the various candidates and to see how they hold up, basically.
So he's kind of the two kind of perception, or if we just stick to perception is about something, and perceiving comes with it knowledge.
Yes.
It gives you knowledge about the world. Right.
Yep.
And we're going to have to tackle both those things in a very different way than kind of.
Yeah. And so the thing I'll flag up, actually, so I remember encountering this. I made some notes on the blog, actually, because it reminded me. When I was working on a paper, I was reading a bunch of Newell and some of the early cognitive psychology guys from the 50s and 60s. And Newell's got this paper where he lays out the very similar kinds of things. So again, just to identify that Turvey's not actually just making stuff up. He's not just pulling stuff out of thin air. He's not setting it up so that ecopsych is the only possible winner. Newell has a paper where he's like, look, if you're going to study perception and cognition, it has to have these kinds of things. It has to be able to do this. It has to be able to do this. And one of his things is intentionality, for example. Cognition has to be about something because it clearly is. And so our theories have to be able to account for this sort of stuff. And he was interested in, our systems have to be flexible enough to be able to respond to all the different things the world can throw at us. And that's the epistemic bit and the intentionality as well. So again, just to identify. And so there's two things there. One is that Turvey is not just setting up a straw man that only he can defeat. He's trying really rigorously and carefully to lay out the actual rules, and people pretty much agree on what those rules are. And the second thing is that even though he's going to say that the ecological approach is going to be the best way of engaging with all of this, all the other attempts have also been good faith attempts in general, really engage with the realities of what you need to do. And they're all trying to find ways to solve the problems because we all basically agree what the problems are. And all Turvey's going to do is just go, we just have to take it seriously that Descartes got this far, panicked, and had to bring God in. And then someone else got so far, panicked, had to bring God in. And then the computational people got this far, panicked, and had to bring in memory or what have you, right? And so all he's going to do is like, look, they're all trying to do the right things and they bring stuff in, but you have to pay attention to when it's not working. Yeah.
I'm bringing this again. I just saw that this is true. Every ecopsych book starts with a history lesson. True. I'll say when you read this, man, Turvey, he builds on. He shows you he's building on the shoulders of China. Like he's always referencing someone. Like this book is really well. It's not just him writing things and kind of claiming them as his own. He's building on so many other people's work and You're right, showing them what they did right and maybe where they went a bit, where we can go from there. Yeah.
And when he was
Maybe
teaching the course, he made the students read all the
yes,
original.
yeah,
That's why they had a reading list this high, right?
yeah, yeah. The even for a I've seen more like the reference page. There's like 3 pages of reference for a 10-page chapter. Yeah, that must have been a fun course. Yeah. So, but yeah. So I think that's a good way to think of it, Andrew. He's kind of So what's kind of our takeaway from the first? We're studying. We're studying. We want to understand perception and action.
Yeah.
We're focusing on perception, obviously, in this book. We need to consider a system, the whole system that has
a physical system of some kind.
Yeah, that has these 3 parts. It has these 2 fundamental properties. It knows things and it's about things.
Yep.
And that's really it. Like like we said at the start, this book's not about direct what can I apply this to, right? This is about understanding the basic principles of ecological psychology.
Yeah, exactly. And just any theory of perception, right? This is why this is hard. This is why people have been banging their heads against this for, as we will discover, hundreds, if not thousands of years, is that trying to figure out how we do what we do is really difficult, right? And trying to build it out of a physical system as well, right? We're going to discover that, Descartes spent all this time working and he was trying to see how far he could go by building cognition out of a physical system. And his main problem was that his theory of his notion of what counted as a physical system just turned out to be not up to scratch, and that we needed a richer understanding, right? And that's going to be another aspect is that, there's only so much you can get out of certain kinds of theories of physics as well, and so you have to pay attention to what maybe there's more interesting physics. And
I think that there's so much kind of really fundamental that really important questions through the history of science, right? We're talking about, whether something's physical or psychological. Can we slice it that way? That's one of the fundamental debates that, scientists have discussed when the mind versus body. So, so like I said, we're building up from first principles. So, just kind of take what you can of these when you read them, I think.
And I think the big lesson, I think you're right, is just the emphasis on we're studying a system, and it's a particular kind of system, and whatever we do has to cope with that.
Yeah, I think it's getting like, if you really wanted to reach, aboutness is starting to get into, it's getting the idea. For me, starting to foreshadow the idea of a soft assembly, almost like it has a purpose. Right? You're perceiving. You're not just perceiving generally. They wanted question here that there's the meteorology. There's an example he gives about the tides, right? The moon.
Oh, right.
Is that where he talks about how if you just look, most people know that if you look at the sun and if you just look at 2 parts of that system, I think, or doesn't he have a diagram of the sun?
Yeah. Let me just quickly whiz through here.
Yeah. If I can, I don't know if anyone can see, probably can't see it. My lights are doing. So he's got, a system when you're just looking at the earth and just looking at the earth and the water and the moon. That's, again, not looking at the whole system, and you have to make crazy inferences to explain. Whereas if you look at the whole system, where you have the earth, water, moon, and sun.
Yeah. So Turvey's doing his usual thing of using the most annoying word he can possibly find, but he is helping. But it's actually the right word. That's always capricious. The other one. But this mereology, right? It's the technical term for the examination of part-whole relations. That's just the name of the process of examining these things. And as you were saying, the fallacy is about looking at the parts that you can see and that you think that you've got, and trying to figure out how to get them to relate to one another in such a way as to produce the behavior. And the fallacy is to not notice when you're missing something.
Yeah, that's a hard part.
Not taking the hint that
Mhm.
you've broken your system down in the wrong way, or that you're missing something critical and slotting out something else
Like
in to do the work.
Yeah. I think this is part of the reason Turvey can be challenging sometimes. I think his examples and like he's trying to explain something complicated and he pulls in a fairly complicated example instead of doesn't pull in here's a toy. Like examples are pretty complex themselves. Like so that's I think that's his analogy. That makes it a little bit challenging for me. Yeah. Yeah, so I think, but those are the fundamental ideas. I think the aboutness, yeah, where perception is intentional. I mean, it's about something in the environment. It's purposeful, goal directed. That's jumping way 42 steps ahead, but
yeah,
that's where I go with that thought. It's not about just the internal. Yeah.
Yeah, and like we're going to discover later on that people are like, yeah, perception is intentional, but if you look at at the raw material of the sensations hitting the retina, there's no intentionality there. So intentionality has to get added in by something else later on. So people were aware that you needed intentionality, but they couldn't get it out of the raw material of sensations. And for Gibson and for Turvey, you take the hint that if you can't get it out of sensations, maybe sensations are the wrong pieces to be working on. But everyone else is going, well, it's pretty obvious that these are the pieces we have working with, so we have to get intentionality from somewhere else. So Turvey's just flagging up, this is just, good, careful science doesn't fall foul to this fallacy because you're trying to be careful all the time. Yeah. And everybody was, like I said, the other thing to remember is everyone was working in good faith and trying to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes you need someone else to come along and go, actually, that thing you thought was really obvious actually turns out to just be a really bad place to start your analysis for this reason and this reason and this reason. But you can't, just because you didn't get there doesn't mean you were being a jerk about it. It just means that you really thought you had good reason to think that that's where you start.
Yeah, I heard of this criticism the other day. This came to mind, that newer theories like ecological psychology, they deliberately attack things that the old theories are not good at explaining.
Yes.
But they sometimes throw out and dismiss the things that the old theory was good at explaining.
Right.
You know what I mean? I don't think that's quite what's going on here. I think, I like Turvey's not starting from, okay, here's the problems with the information processing. It doesn't explain variability. Like he does. That's not where Turvey starts.
No,
he starts. What's the bottom? What's the goal? How do we understand perception, or how we interact with our world? So
yeah. I think so. He's working right under the hood.
Yes.
We haven't even got to people trying to solve these problems yet. He's just identifying what are the problems that everyone's trying to solve.
Yes.
He is going to get into critiquing specific attempts to solve problems, though, and that's going to be
yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So tough going, but I think so. Lecture 2. So yeah, these are I should put it. They're not called chapters; they're called lectures. Rightfully so.
So we have there's one question there.
Okay.
Is intentionality the same as goal-directed behavior? They are related to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Behavior can be goal-directed because perception has intentionality.
Mm-hmm.
I think is the way to think about that.
Yeah.
So it's clearly a feature of the system, and so it's something we're on the hook for explaining. We need to figure out how intentionality arises in this kind of system, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And but John nailed this, right? First step is he's framing the question of, of perceiving the way. He's spending a lot of time. What does it mean to perceive, right? He's spending a lot of time not just dismissing that. You've got to frame it in the right way.
Yeah.
Okay, so lecture 2, dualism, or organism-environment dualism. Okay. This is interesting. It's kind of both old and new, right? This idea of it's still around. It's a classic mind-body dualism by Descartes. It's still a thing we complain about. task decomposition,
Mm-hmm.
training, prep, perception separate from action. So it's still really. So I don't know where to start with it. This was one I thought, oh, I understand. This is gonna be easy. Oh no, it wasn't. I thought I understand.
We haven't even got into the details yet. It takes us a few chapters to get anywhere near Descartes. But right. So I think one of the things here is he's just identifying that. So he's identified that we're talking about systems,
Mm-hmm.
and he's identified that systems come with environments,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone's on board with that.
Yeah.
Even Descartes. But part of the issue is that for Descartes, for example, the system and the environment are two different things, two different kinds of things.
Yes.
And so he's identifying that, again, you have a system, you have an environment, and the first thing that pretty much everybody goes to is that those two things are different things. Mm-hmm. And that you have to talk. And so when you study the environment, psychology, right? It's kind of implied in a couple of points in this chapter where he's just going, look, the environment isn't studied by psychologists. The environment is studied by physicists, geologists, chemists, right? Mm-hmm. And whatever they give us to work with, that's what the system gets to work with.
Yeah. There's a couple of, this chapter really gets into the idea of adapting.
Yes.
And the idea that the actor adapts to the environment. The environment is given.
Yes.
Right. And they adapt to their niche and yeah, I think that's a really important point. But
yeah, and so it's funny because this connects up. So famously, Gibson's 1979 book spends, I think it's 5 chapters talking about what an environment is before he gets anywhere near an I.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's and it's one of the things that always stuck out to me. It's a super weird way to write a psychology textbook, right? And so
talking about it is, because psychology is the study of human behavior, and you're not talking about the human. You're saying, like, what's going on here?
Yeah. Perception, yeah, and so one of the lessons of Gibson is, the traditional notion of perception is that visual perception begins at the eye, is kind of the assumption. Whereas for Gibson, one of the intuitions of the ecological approach is, no, actually, visual perception begins in the environment.
Yes.
And then that's why talking about system and environment systems is going to be central, because all of these things matter. But I think at this point, Turvey's he's just identifying the typical lay of the land and flagging up that just because everyone's done it this way in the past doesn't mean it's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
Everyone else has done it this way and eventually run out of ideas and had to panic. Maybe one of the things we need to do is to do something different. And so again, he's just kind of he's setting up that, because we're going to have, and again, over a bunch of chapters, we're going to spend a lot of time banging against people going, right, my new theory of perception involves a completely different notion of what the organism is and what it interacts with, but doesn't change what we think we know about the environment, because physicists haven't changed what they think they're talking about the environment, for example, right? So yeah, I think he's just signposting at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right, framing the problem, and
yeah,
I think that's a real key. Like I like the idea. Starts with the environment. The perception is not it's not a property of the human. It's a property of the system, which is the environment. Yeah. So he talks about adapting to the environment. How about the Newton, when he gets into Newton, talking about states and dynamical laws? I thought that was pretty heavy going for me. I think he was talking about, he's getting into dynamical systems. I should mention, he does throw the complex system word a few times, but he's not ready.
Well, so right, why is he talking about Newtonian mechanics at this point? So again, one of the themes of this book is that the reason why he's talking about Newton's mechanics is that Newton's mechanics has been the guiding description, or the governing description of the physical environment to be perceived for 350 years. And the fact that it's an incomplete understanding of what's out there is the source of most of the problems of the theories of perception that we have so far. So that's going to become a theme again and again. So setting up, in that case, why, so it's going to become important to understand some of the things you commit to believing when you think Newton accurately described the physics of the universe. And there's and it's not just the laws of motion and various things like that. There's a lot of
he talks about recursion.
There's a lot of ontological,
how we change states.
Yes, so there's a lot of ontological commitments.
It's all about
but there's a lot of ontological commitments, right? So, for example, the idea that you get to here because you were here and you applied a rule, and then you did it again, and then you did it again, and then you did it again, versus a more continuous, dynamical kind of evolution over time. And there's a lot of Newtonian mechanics comes with a lot of ontological baggage, a lot of assumptions about how things actually are. That are required to make Newton's stuff work, right? And that's going to come up again and again.
Put at this comment by John Gregory. What about Richard Gregory's suggestion that buffalo are adapted to the plains, but actually plains are created by buffalo, by their grazing, packing soil, fertilizing the soil, right? I think this is you're starting to get a little flavor of circular causality, right?
Yes.
Like we can't say this, which is what not in Newton at all, right? Which is really what we're going to push it back against. I think that it's not a direct straight line cause.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that you're emphasizing that Richard Gregory talked about, because Gregory's a famous indirect perception guy, right?
Yeah.
One of the key figures in this. So it's interesting. So again, I think that's quite interesting in the sense that it's not the case that people like Gregory didn't know that they had to front up to things like this. It's that they fronted up to them using a particular set of tools.
Yeah.
And again, it was all good faith. That's another thing that keeps coming out of this. Given the tools that I have, what can I do? I can do this, I can do this, but I can't do that. So I'll try and do these things, and I'll keep going to see how long it can work.
Yeah.
And that's kind of actually all ecological.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. As much as we kind of attack, like the idea that your brain has memory and represents things, not a crazy idea, is it? Like it's pretty
and very nonsensical, right?
Yeah. It's just
these ideas just didn't. Yeah, people just didn't come up with these ideas because they thought, we
want to give the brain something to do, make it sound important.
It's like, no, representations and memory are designed to try and solve some of these problems of intentionality and things like that.
Well, John said it. He said it wasn't Richard Gregory. So yeah. So Richard Gregory was studying visual illusion. Yeah. Another great read. Read some of Richard Gregory's stuff. A very different view.
But actually, John made another point here. Note that the physicists didn't discover optical flow fields or affordances. That's really important, right? Physicists, affordances are physical things, but they're not the kinds of things that a physicist finds. They're the kind of things a psychologist paying attention to the physical world discover, because their affordances are the kinds of things you see in the environment of a system, not in the physics of an abstract physical universe with no observer. That's another issue here, is that the system and the environment thing, there's this notion of complementarity, right? So an environment isn't just the physical stuff around me, it's the physical stuff around me implied by the way that I am because of the kind of system that I am, for example.
I think that's a good point. I think you're going to push back against the traditional physics of describing. That's, I like drawing it back to, I think we're getting into the aboutness, right? We're not just describing the environment in terms of distance, sizes, speeds, right? Once you get into aboutness, that's when you get affordances, and you get, once the physics changes. And
there isn't a lot of aboutness in Newtonian mechanics.
No,
is another problem, right? So if Newtonian mechanics is, yeah, exactly, physics is designed to be observer independent. Well, 17th century mechanical physics definitely was, absolutely was fully designed to be that, because that's what they thought was the value way. But of course, modern physics, 21st century physics, has observers coming out of everywhere, right? Relativity entails observers, quantum entails observation and points of reference and all that sort of good stuff. So, like, yeah, that loopiness of things is actually, and again, Turvey's going to start pointing to this, is that modern physics has thrown a lot of that observer independent stuff away because as being a mistake.
Yeah, I think he's really trying to get you setting up through historical kind of understanding where these ideas come from. Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to think of it. What else do we got? Yeah, reinforcement. What do you take of the CES spectroscopy section? That's a tricky.
Yeah. So it's another Turvey word. Hang on, I'm going to just have a quick look on my blog because I think I wrote something down about this because it was bugging me at the time and I was trying to figure out what the hell he's doing. I'm
going to put it here.
What did I say? So, right. So, right. So he's laying out spectroscopy is just what you do when you're a physicist to try and figure out what the system is made of.
So here, I'm going to put here's a link to Andrew's blog if you're anyone.
Yeah, so you do. Yeah. So right. So the notion of spectroscopy is like, so think about like you examine the light coming off a planet through a telescope and you can get a lot of information about the chemical composition of the atmosphere because of the way of what's in the light and what's not in it. And so spectroscopy is just a way of analyzing a physical system to get a sense of its composition. This CES spectroscopy is just a very Turvey kind of phrase where he's saying that we need some methods for examining the composition and structure of these systems, but we need a spectroscopy that's not looking for these elemental particles independent of one another. We need a spectroscopy that's looking for these systems. And I think he blames Iberl for this, who's a big systems guy and dynamical systems guy. And so it's a way of analyzing physical systems, not in a reductionist way, but in a systems way. So it's just, that's all he's trying to get out of it, I think.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. But this is going to be a feature of Turvey. Sometimes he's just going to give things names that when you think about it for a little while, you're like, yes, that's exactly the correct word. But that was a really annoying way of doing it.
That's what I was like. His analogies and examples. You're like, whoa, that does not make it easier to understand. But once you think, oh, that's actually a pretty good description. But, but that did not help my understanding one bit by you calling it, making that connection.
Yes.
So, but so I think you're right. I think there's these kind of. I think these two chapters are kind of connected, right? He's building on but still framing the question, what's perception, what, making the fundamental. We can talk about the two part. We don't need a separate language to talk about what's going on physically in your body and what's going on in the environment.
Right. We just need the right kind of language.
Yes.
And one of the lessons is going to be that the physics of the 17th century is not the right language because it's not up to the challenges of describing the kind of system we've all just agreed we're studying.
Yeah. Am I right to think, like, to simplify as Newton, he's talking about some very linear ideas, or is that oversimplifying? Whereas we're going to get into non-linear.
There's certainly, I think linearity is certainly part of the limitations. There's also sort of I'm trying to remember, this is where my physics starts to fall apart a little bit. So part of it, I think, is the assumption. So Newtonian mechanics is all about how systems change state as a result of the forces that are acting on them.
Yes.
And that gives you a pretty complete way of describing how a projectile flies through the Earth, through the atmosphere, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining why I moved my hand to catch it. There are forces involved, and I have to wrangle those forces, but none of that explains why I did that. None of it explains the intentionality, why I moved and the intentionality is a critical part of my behavior. I moved my hand so as to intercept that ball because I am currently playing a game of softball and I am a fielder and it's my job to catch the ball. There's big chunks of that just you can't explain with Newtonian mechanics. You need information flowing through a system, but you also need you need to get there's no aboutness in the Newtonian mechanics, and so it's not just the linearity issues, but it's about the pieces that you have to work with can't build an intentional system.
Yeah, and they're also going to be, I think there's importantly the equations that describe projectile motion are not information.
Absolutely.
We don't have access to some of the quantities like velocity, and we don't have radar guns in our head.
Yep.
And so you're right, they can't really describe the perception action. Newton's description of moving bodies is not going to do the job.
But and again, this gets back to the good faith thing, is that for a long time that was the physics that we had to work with, and it worked really well. Like the thing, like Newtonian mechanics was an incredible development.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so everybody looked at this and was like, "This is amazing. Look at this. I can look at the kind of precision I can describe the physical environment with. Look, I've now got all these mathematical tools that I can use to quantify the physical. This is astonishing, and it works.
Oh, yeah, we still teach projectile motion the same way as well.
Right? Like, so everybody looked at that and was like, "This is an amazing set of tools. Let's see if we can use these tools to build a description of the physical world that can then slot into perception." And then it just turns out that when you do that, you run into trouble. But you had to go through that process, right? You had to discover that these tools weren't up to the job by really trying, and so people did, and that's fair.
Yeah, I think I was just doing some calculations in baseball yesterday. I was using the classic projectile motion. Yeah, they're still very useful. I think the key for me, I always take the purpose of our perception action system is not describing things in the world environment, right? It's not, physics is describing, Newton was describing and predicting the motion of objects, right? That's not, like, this is I think last year or 2 years ago, Bill Warren had a great article. We talked about perception as a well-posed problem.
Yes.
Right? I don't know if you read that, right? You have to understand what is perception. If you pose the problem of perception as describing exactly what's going on in the outside world, it fails miserably.
Yes.
That's not what it's trying to do, right, in ecological psychology. So I think, again, framing the question, framing the problem, that's what Turvey's trying to do here.
And I think basically Bill's paper is sitting on top of all of the hard work that Turvey is currently grinding us through, right?
Yeah.
That argument that Bill's making sits on top of all of this hard work.
Yes,
that's why that argument is something that can be made now, is because we've got this hard work, and now we're just going back to the hard work and engaging with the details of building that argument about why it's the right way of describing.
I think Turvey, you want to kind of understand experientially kind of where why Gibson had these ideas, where they came from. I think that's where this book is heading, which I appreciate. It doesn't make it as the easiest read, but that's, because you got to get a lot of history.
But he's also going to teach us not to panic as well. He wants us to not make the same mistakes as everybody else. And people have been making basically the same kind of mistakes over and over and over and over and over again with different theories of perception. Yeah. And again, this is what makes the ecological approach quite interesting, is that it's not just another example of doing the same thing but with slightly flashier tools. It's an entirely different way of thinking about what might be available to solve the problem. And like I said, it'll either work or it won't. It's now on us to try and do the science.
I think fundamentally, what what perception's job is and
Yeah.
what it has to work with, right? Is what he's trying to start off with, and you kind of not getting those right, not or treating those differently than and ecological psychology lets you appeal to other, like you said, loans on intelligence.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So, but yeah, so yeah, that's kind of that. I don't know if there's anything else out of there I would take. I think that's kind of the basic
I think that
take home. Yeah,
those are certainly the main things I think for me.
yeah,
And again, like I say, it's early days at scene setting, and there's a bunch of reasons why we're talking about this that aren't yet quite apparent, but we're getting there.
yeah. And
So
then
there is an element of just holding on and trusting that Turvey's telling us this for a reason.
Yes.
And remembering to notice when the reason shows up a little bit later on. And there's definitely at least a little bit of that for this first bit.
Yeah. And next chapter, we're going to get into direct and indirect perception. So obviously that's very important. Again, and Turvey's way of talking about it. So we're going to get really in the nitty gritty. But yeah, so I think that's, like I said, for someone that's approaching this from trying to understand for applications, I think you can see we're a long way from there. But I think it's useful. I think it's kind of understanding the kind of the history and the principles and what the key. I don't know if it took me for a long time to what the key differences are between the ecological psychology is proposing. Yes. Like they're so fundamental, so low level that I think we miss them sometimes.
And this gets back to, I think I was just thinking about what you're saying there, and it gets back to that old argument of, can't you just pick and choose, right? Why are you ecological types so grumpy about picking and choosing from different theories? And kind of the reason this book is the hard work of demonstrating that if you're picking and choosing, you're picking from two completely different recipe books that make no sense together. They're not working with the same tools. They're not following the same rules. They're not built out of the same stuff. And so this isn't going to convince anybody that you shouldn't pick and choose, but this kind of work is the reason why we don't think you can pick and choose. It's because if you do, then all you're doing is falling back into bad habits that psychology and theories of perception have been in for hundreds of years, and that we're trying to get away from because those bad habits led to problems, right? And so I think maybe that's another way of thinking about this, is that this is the hard work of trying to establish why you might not want to pick and choose.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true. I think, showing that I did a presentation a long time ago, like I think I called it roots versus branches or something.
Yes, absolutely.
Like indirect, these are the roots of indirect perception. And we're going to see they're growing in very different parts of the fields, right? And once you commit to like what a system is and not doing dualism, then you can't go back, right? You can't in a way. Yeah. So, but yeah. Well, I think that's all I got. Any other kind of take home messages, Andrew? Or?
No, I think just everyone listening, and if you're interested in Turvey, just stick with it. Take your time, and we'll get there. And it is hard, and that's okay. That's the other thing. That's the other thing. And so I've been thinking about Turvey again recently, and one of the things he gave us as a community, I think, was permission to realize that this stuff is hard. And he gave like all of this theoretical background. It's permission to kind of hold on and grit your teeth while you don't have a solution just yet, because it is hard. And so anyway.
Yeah, I think it's kind of progressively building and understanding. So yeah, no, I agree. I think it's worth the effort. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think so too.
But so I don't know when the next time we can arrange to do this, but we'll keep cracking on and see what we can make of it. Like I said, there's some just to foreshadow that, like this first section I should have said is called foundational concepts, which is pretty self-evident. but he's going to get into more kind of. So we've got a ways to go in there, and we're going to talk. He's going to get into computation and representational, and then finally the ecological perspective, which I think it's really worthwhile. Like I always get asked, why is it called ecological psychology?
Mm-hmm.
You're really going to understand if you make it that far. You're really going to understand where that comes from, because Turvey is not going to take that for granted.
Absolutely, yeah.
So well, thanks, Andrew. Always a fun. Like I said, I bring you on for things that are hard to talk about, like our famous episode on memory, right?
Exactly.
So
it's always good for me to engage with this. Like I said, every time I engage properly with Turvey's writing, I get a little smarter. So it's always good for me to come back and engage with all of this stuff. So it's fun to.
Yeah, I think you understand. It's multiple read thing where you understand a little more every time you read it. So, but yeah. So thanks everyone for the great questions and comments. Keep them coming, or offline. So we'll probably, I don't know how we like to slice this up. Maybe another 2 chapters next time. We'll see if it makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
And check out Andrew's blog. You went through like roughly half the book, I would say.
Oh no, I'm still.
I'll put it in the show, but Andrew.
I think I made it as far as the Gestalt stuff about the space enigmas, which is all about space.
Yeah.
But this has encouraged me to get back into it, actually, so I can stay ahead of the
finish it. Yeah. So so thanks for joining me, Andrew, and thanks everyone, and we'll keep an eye out for. I'll post the next time when we can find time to read. Okay.
Excellent.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Just okay.